Talking with you on Talkback, I'm Bharati Jagdish.
I'm Keith D'Souza.
Anger has erupted in a string of majority Muslim countries after French magazine Charlie Hebdo responded to the attack on its offices on January the 7th by running yet another caricature last week depicting the Prophet Muhammad under the headline, "All is Forgiven." Now, on January 7th this year, you would know that 2 Islamist gunmen killed 12 people in Charlie Hebdo's offices, sparking 3 days of terror in France. Now, the magazine has again defended its right to media freedom. Now, we've said nothing should justify acts of terrorism,
Indeed.
but should there be limits to media freedom? What is the balance between media freedom and media responsibility?
No, it isn't the first time that satire has resulted in unrest. In 2005, cartoons in Danish and Norwegian newspapers depicting the Prophet Muhammad in unflattering poses sparked outrage among Muslims across the Middle East. There were protests, economic boycotts, and warning of possible retaliation. What do you make of these arguments that suggest that audiences should learn how to peel apart the layers of satire and comment and deal with it differently? Is this reasonable? This question we're asking you this morning. Would reining in the media be construed as yielding to terrorists? Shouldn't cultural, religious, and socio-economic landscapes of a country across countries factor into how media exercise its freedom? And of course, are such media messages merely creating fertile ground for terrorists to recruit already disenfranchised members of society?
We want to know where you stand on the issue of media freedom versus media responsibility. How can there be a better balance between the two? How do you process such messages? Call us on 669-11938. Of course, you can also talk to us on Facebook, official 938 Live. We'll be going to some of your responses in just a moment. But first, joining us today, our research fellow at the Institute of Policy Studies, Dr. Carol Soon, and 938 Live's Deputy Chief Editor, Jaime. Now, while no act should be justification for terrorist attacks, where do you stand on the issue, Carol?
Hi, good morning, everyone. I think this whole incident, unfortunate series of incidents, essentially revolves around the issue of, say, freedom of religion, freedom of media, which all boils down to free speech. Now, typically, what we're seeing right now is a lot of debate that seems to suggest a false dichotomy between absolute free speech versus no speech. In other words, there should either be unfettered free speech or speech that is censored. But free speech should also be tempered with reason and sensibility, and certainly with taste and decency. So if we look at the issue of freedom of expression, now freedom of expression is typically given a broader latitude in the United States. But even in the United States, we see legal limitations on speech that involves incitement, libel, obscenity, or child pornography.
Hate speech as well.
Yes. Similarly, in countries such as Denmark, Australia, and the UK, they have laws to provide redress to people who are vilified on account of their race, ethnicity, or sexual orientation. So at the end of the day, provocative, agitating, or denigrating speech should always be evaluated in terms of the impact that they have on people, communities, and the society.
Of course, some media practitioners would say it's really open to interpretation. There was no intention behind this particular cartoon to incite any of these feelings. You talked about reason, sensibility, taste, decency. Jaime, let's bring you in on this. Those things some people would say are completely subjective.
Yeah, well, actually, what I would do is frame the discussion a little bit differently. Just looking at one side of the argument that we've heard, especially from Western media and commentators from there, is that somehow or other, and I agree entirely with Carol, that there is a false dichotomy that they've produced, which I think is mischievous, if not disingenuous.
Because we're talking here more about a balance rather than an either-or.
Exactly.
Right?
So the minute you make it into a either-or argument, then you create these false divisions which may not even exist. So I think a more constructive debate is actually what constitutes media responsibility within the overall context of press freedoms and media freedoms. And I think that would be a more constructive debate now, rather than going into saying, for example, if you don't support Charlie Hebdo, you are somehow condoning what happened during the attacks, or you are somehow other questioning free speech. I think those are quite unhelpful.
That old, if you're not with us, you're against us.
Yes, that's precisely what's not needed. I think let's just put aside what happened. The incident, as I said, nobody's giving excuses for what happened. But let's have a constructive debate on what constitutes the levels of responsibility that's needed.
Call us on 669-11938. Have this constructive debate with us.
In Singapore, are we more sensitive because of our multiracial and the problems that we've had? Are we more aware of the sensitivities in reporting the news?
Oh, of course. I mean, that's without doubt. That's something that we've grown up with. And I think it's a cultural thing as well. If you go back to what some people have said is probably more acceptable in France, which actually may or may not even be the case. But if you look at the culture of French satire and parody and all that, there will be some, for example, in Charlie Hebdo, who said this is acceptable, accept it. But
and satire in France has targeted not just Muslims but practically every community, the Jews, so on and so forth as well. So they have often said that this was not a targeted satirical attack on any particular community.
You see, it's to even understand that, you have to understand the French mentality and the French culture in how they use parody, because it's a dual layered, is what people like to say, and you really have to understand what these dual layers are. Let me give you an example from a recent cover a couple of years ago when and this is in the US media, when he was running for president. There was a cover on a magazine that showed Barack Obama dressed as a Muslim, and Michelle Obama as a terrorist. Now that cover, if you look at it on face value, would be quite extraordinarily offensive. But that came from a left-leaning magazine, which was actually characterizing and criticizing Obama's critics. So you really have to have a very deep understanding of what the media stands for, and these dual-layer sort of criticisms that are being played at. And if you don't, then you will just read it at face value, and it will become quite offensive.
But that's the thing. Can audiences be expected to peel apart all these layers? Now, Carol, earlier you talked about reason, sensibility, taste, decency, and you framed it as the media needs to be aware of the impact it might have on audiences in terms of deciding what is reason, what is sensible, what is reasonable as well, I'm guessing. To what extent do you think that this responsibility should fall on the media, or should it fall on the audience to sit down and actually look carefully into what they're seeing and what they are taking objection to?
All right, I think that's a very good question, and I think before I answer that, I just want to add on to what Jaime had just said about political satire. Now, with regards to political satire and whether society is ready for satire, let's just remember that political satire, as with other genres, comes in different shades and colors. There isn't just one type of political satire. Political satire can be crass, it can also be tastefully done. Similarly, different segments of the society have different thresholds or tolerance, and so at the end of the day, it really boils down to a fair bit of sense and sensibility and ethos on the part of the media organization. So back to your question, right, with regards to whose responsibility is it? Is it the media's responsibility or the audience's responsibility? Let's just look at it this way. I mean, Communication 101, right, talks about communication as a process where a sender transmits a message to a receiver. Now, media organizations are very powerful senders because they have the capability to transmit messages to many people at one time. So, the media organization's intent may not be understood by audiences or readers all the time. Because why? We, as human beings, have our own frames of references that are couched in our own personal experiences. So these frames of references influence how we interpret a message. So the case of Charlie Hebdo is a case in point. Now, the editors had argued on more than one occasion that its caricatures are merely criticisms of religious fundamentalists and not the religious community per se. But clearly, that is not how people within and even outside the religious community perceive it. So I think certainly media organizations should be mindful with the kind of messages that they're sending across. Similarly, audiences, over time would also acquire some kind of a critical ability and a certain degree of thick skin, or immunity to certain messages, and be able to have a productive discourse over what is acceptable and what is not. So I think the dynamics between audience and media organizations is constantly evolving, and both sides have a part to play on so-called improving the tenor of discourse.
Right, and how can the tenor of the discourse be improved? Should the media be waiting for society to be ready to be able to receive such messages without anger? Or does the media have an agenda-setting role to evoke thought and help society become ready? That's what we'll be talking about next on Talkback. Getting you talking this morning on Talkback, talking all about media freedom versus media responsibility in light of renewed anger that has erupted in a string of majority Muslim countries after French magazine Charlie Hebdo responded to the attack on its offices earlier this month by running yet another caricature last week depicting the Prophet Muhammad. We're going to be taking your calls as well on 669-11938.
Jacqueline and Arik are waiting patiently. Shall we take a call? Let's see what Arik has to say. Arik, good morning.
Morning.
Yes, sir. Your thoughts on the issue?
Yes, this is a very sensitive issue, but Europe should have to realize what their freedom of speech. One side they say the freedom of speech. When the last president, Mr. Sarkozy, the son was a married one, is a Jewish rich girl, and one newspaper highlighted that this man is married for money, and this newspaper have to say to President Sarkozy for excuse, sorry. So what is the freedom of speech? They are directly attacked to the one of the religion, and they say this is the freedom of speech. Europe have a double scandal. This area, if they have a freedom of speech, why don't debate on Holocaust? Why I cannot go and speak there is a Holocaust if there is no Holocaust?
Right. I mean, they have laws against Holocaust denial in France. Arik, how would you suggest organizations can better balance media freedom and freedom of speech with media responsibility here? Because I'm sure that you're not advocating a situation where everything is censored completely as well. How do you think a better balance can be struck here?
This very sensitive issue must have a debate in UNO, and they have to fix the rules. And so, where is the religion matter? Nobody had attacked. Everybody have a religion freedom. They can go for its own way, but I cannot say which you are right or you are wrong, or I can say for those are respectable religion affectors. We talk on them. We can debate, but cannot be criticism like this is not for those are direct help to people.
Right. Thank you very much for that, Arik.
Taken.
Let's see what Jacqueline has to say about this. She joins us too on 669-11938. Hi, Jacqueline.
Yes, ma'am.
I know we have to be very sensitive to almost everything, but I see as a cartoon, nothing more. Something, that's why it's called cartoon. Thank you. Good day.
Thanks very much for that. You see, I think that brings us to the next point. It is all open to interpretation. Many Muslims themselves out there might say, you know what? This is something I'm offended by. Let's not give it any more thought. Let's just ignore it. Others, of course, those who have been recruited by terrorist organizations would then carry out a terrorist attack or see it as an excuse to do so. That moderate Muslims themselves would not endorse a terrorist attack. So here's the thing. You will see different responses from different groups of people, Carol. So here's the question. Should the media wait for society to be ready to be able to receive such messages? Because some might argue then again that the media has that agenda-setting role to evoke thought, help society become ready. And of course, reasonable people might take offense to it, but certainly would not carry out terrorist attacks in response.
That is a very good question. It's a typical chicken and egg question, right? So there are many people who feel that because the society is still highly sensitive to certain issues such as those around race and religion, we should avoid these topics to minimize misunderstanding and conflict and only start talking about issues when people are ready. But how do we know when people are ready if they don't ever talk about it or they don't have a chance to share their thoughts? I mean, differences and contention can only be resolved through greater understanding, right? As human beings, we are limited by our own experiences and our involving people who are similar to us. So I think this is where I think the media actually have a very important and powerful ability to bring people with different experiences and backgrounds together. So in that regard, I would say that the media has a very privileged role to play. Now, certainly what the media can do, right, is to really facilitate conversations and exchanges, especially when it comes to, say, providing two sides of the story. And in the process of doing so, ideally to refrain from, say, emotional language and be non-partisan. So at the end of the day, I feel that the question is not what to say, but really how to say it. So it's really not about the subject, but the approach. So if we want to be optimistic and look at the brighter side of the current developments of Charlie Hebdo, we can see that it has generated so much debate on various issues, like, for example, the marginalization or radicalization of fundamentalist Muslims, a debate on free speech, where are the limits of free speech, and what are the repercussions on unfettered freedom of speech. So, and you can see that even among, say, the French who are non-Muslims, there is quite a diversity of views. So according to a poll that was published yesterday, 42% objected to the publishing of cartoons as they are offensive, while 57% that the cartoons should not be banned just because they offend Muslims. So I think these, well, unfortunately, the entire incident has taken on rather violent manifestations. These are very, very useful debates to have, and I think the media does play a very crucial role.
Now, Jaime, where do you stand on this in terms of the media having to test the waters practically all the time?
Yeah, going back to that, and then your question about the role of the media in setting the agenda, I certainly agree that is part of our role in telling our listeners, telling our audience what we think they need to know. But that has to be in the context of what we see as part of the overall public interest in what is acceptable at what point in time, exactly the kind of things we have to deal with. And if I go back to what Eric was saying, one of our earlier callers, about what the situation and what perceptions are in Europe, a very good opinion piece that I read in Deutsche Welle a couple of days ago. And this is in Europe. These are the Germans talking. I'll just read a couple of lines here and you'll know what we're talking about. Basically, they say the job of media organizations and journalists is to assess, weigh, and present the information that they deem important and relevant for their audience in a manner they think is best suited to achieve that purpose. So that is the challenge that we have to face. What purpose do we want to convey? And what is useful for that? And I think quite often, if you are objective, some of the things that Charlie Hebdo does may not be overall helpful in that regard.
You are listening to Talkback on 938 Live. We're talking about media responsibility, media freedom. Where do you draw the line? Our guests, of course, the boss, Deputy Chief Editor of 938 Live, Jaime Ho, and of course, Dr. Carol Sun from the Institute of Policy Studies. Talkback will continue.
Getting you talking today all about the balance between media freedom and media responsibility. Now, anger has erupted again in a string of majority Muslim countries after French magazine Charlie Hebdo responded to the attack on its offices earlier this month by running yet another caricature last week depicting the Prophet Muhammad under the headline, "All is Forgiven." But is all forgiven? Call us on 669-11938. Would reigning in the media be construed as yielding to terrorists? What do you make of arguments that suggest that audiences should just learn how to peel apart the layers of satire and comment and deal with it differently? Is this reasonable? Now, although nothing should justify acts of terror, should there be limits to media freedom? What is the balance here between freedom and responsibility? Of course, some argue that by doing this, Charlie Hebdo is merely giving the terrorists an excuse to carry out more attacks.
Them on.
Yep. Yet again, others might say reasonable people would be offended by this, sure, but they certainly wouldn't go to the extent of carrying out an attack.
Indeed.
So, of course, you have a different audience, very many different people consuming this type of information. What is the responsibility of the media then? Let's go to our phone lines first. Peter joins us now. Hi, Peter.
Hi, good morning.
Morning.
I think there are a few aspects of this that are important. One is that it's a magazine that sells articles for a living. So they want to incite, excite, and that brings in the profits. If they print a boring article, nothing will happen. So that's their agenda under the thing. However, on the other hand, what they print can really poke at the wrong people. And in general, it doesn't mean if they poke one religion or the other. It makes it equal if they poke everybody equally. But we don't want to go to the extent where we're ultra-sensitive. Like even in France now, there are some towns who are suing people for putting up Christmas symbols then, and that's going to the extreme. But we must realize that, on the other hand, the violent extremists will take any opportunity to then incite their people and say, you see, the West is against us and all that. And they don't respond the same way with humor and wit. They respond with violence. So
exactly. I mean, it gives them an excuse to further their own agendas.
Yeah. I think it's also a balance because we're not France, we're Singapore. I have Indian, Malay, and even other neighbors, and we live happily together because we don't take the differences in culture for granted, and we should keep it that way rather than celebrate the Charlie Hebdo as heroes and martyrs, which they are not. Nor do we go to the extreme of poking fun unnecessarily. If I'm a Christian, the other guy is a Muslim, you do your thing in your own little garden, and that's it. But once you put it out in the media like this, then it's very explosive, and we don't really need this to sell the papers.
Thank you very much for that, Peter, indeed. Let's talk about an important point that Peter brought up. While you want to be careful and responsible, it is also not ideal for media organizations, or any organization for that matter, to become too careful and to exercise too much self-censorship, or even censorship by the establishment. Jaime, where do you stand on this?
Those were quite excellent points by Peter, and I agree with him almost entirely. In terms of being ultra-sensitive as to what he said and what you're asking now, I don't think we are there. You see much worse examples of
You're talking about in our context in Singapore?
Yeah. I don't think we are, because you do see extremes on both ends, ultra-sensitivity or freewheeling, you say whatever you want to say, kind of liberalness. I don't think we're there. I think we are where we are for a reason, and I think we have moved as a society, we have moved as a media, and I think we are probably at a quite comfortable place where we do recognize people's red lines. We must recognize that everyone has their different red lines, because even in France, as someone has said in our earlier call, they have their red lines in terms of what issues are open and what issues are not. And I think we have come to quite a comfortable position now that we generally, as Peter said, are aware of everyone's red lines and how to treat them when we need to.
Okay.
Let's see what Carol Soon has to say about this. Carol Soon is a research fellow at the Institute of Policy Studies. You just heard from 938 Live's Deputy Chief Editor Jaime Ho. Carol, where do you stand on this? Ultimately, how can newsrooms balance the need for responsibility versus what some in the West may argue is simply censorship, whether self-censorship or otherwise?
When we talk about media organizations, again, let us be cognizant of the fact that there are many different types of media organizations, right? And different organizations have very different philosophies and objectives. So, for example, if you look at, the roots of, say, the Western media, right, where media plays the role of a fourth estate that keeps tab on government and political parties, etc., that approach tends to be a bit more investigative, right, and in many ways confrontational. And then you have media that play the role of, say, nation building and support the state. And you have media which are interested in neither of the above, and they just want to entertain. And like what Peter mentioned earlier, to attract the eyeballs and to attract advertising revenue. So the point is, all kinds of reporting has a certain degree of subjectivity. And it is very simply due to the fact that reporters and journalists have time and space constraints, and they are also motivated by, the professional desire to provide a fresh angle, right? So news producers and writers frame the stories, and whenever the framing happens, there is subjectivity. Now, that said, there are certain standards to uphold in order for a media to put itself across as a credible and, say, professional news media organization. So currently, my colleagues and I in IPS, we are doing a study on the rationality of online space. But I think a lot of lessons can be drawn to, say, traditional news media organizations. So if we look at the kind of literature and research done on journalism and rational discourse, rationality typically holds certain characteristics, one of which is being two-sided instead of being one-sided in your reporting, refraining from using emotional language, and being non-partisan. So I think that these are perhaps some useful guidelines which could be considered by media organizations if they want to come across as being trustworthy and credible.
In whatever field they are reporting, of course. Whether it's entertainment, whatever it is, whatever their aims and objectives are. Stay with us on 938 Live. We'll continue on Talkback in just a moment. Going to be taking your phone calls next on 669-11938. Thanks for joining us on Talkback on 938 Live. I'm Bharati Jagdish with Keith D'Souza. Today talking all about the balance between media freedom and media responsibility in light of the fact that anger has erupted in a string of majority Muslim countries after the French magazine Charlie Hebdo responded to the attack on its offices earlier this month by running yet another caricature last week depicting the Prophet Muhammad. We're joined today by research fellow at the Institute of Policy Studies, Dr. Carol Soon, and 938 Live's Deputy Chief Editor, Jaime Ho. But let's go to the phone lines first.
Mr. Liu, good morning.
Hi, good morning.
Your comment, sir.
Yeah, I have a few points to make. The first one is that Charlie Hebdo has been publishing such things for the last 22 years without any incidents. And also, they lampoon not just, they lampoon any religions, all right, for that matter. So that's one thing. The second thing is obviously the circulation is only 60,000. But after the attack, they sold like 3 to 5 million copies. So I'm not sure whether the so-called terrorists got their objective right. The third point I'm trying to make is that it's a tradition in France. Obviously, for this kind of publications, this kind of anger taken by the media in Singapore. Must not happen, all right?
Okay, you say it must not happen. However, what principles do you think ought to be guiding editorial decisions?
Well,
because you yourself said that in France there is a tradition of doing this, and it did not spark the type of attack that we have seen in the most recent case of Charlie Hebdo, even though the magazine has been providing political satire for many, many years now and has lampooned many more communities.
Right.
So in Singapore, and across the world, in fact, I mean, considering that it can be unpredictable when a particular cartoon or a particular news report or commentary could spark violence, what principles do you think should be guiding editorial decisions, generally speaking?
I think the principle should be how much would the journalists and the press media want to pay the price for their insistence on having total freedom of speech.
Okay, thank you very much. Another caller coming in. Juan, good morning.
Yeah, I think I agree with the previous caller's last statement. What is the price they want to pay? Because if you insist on something like that, your security forces will have to be on alert. Your citizens are obviously at risk. And of course, Bharati, is a difficult question. What are the guiding principles? But then again, if the European nations are so liberal as they claim to be, then why do they ban the publication of Nazi propaganda and Mein Kampf, for example? So obviously there are red lines that they refuse to cross. So why do you cross here, you see?
Right. I understand. Maybe there should be a consistency in terms of how such issues are dealt with. Thank you very much for that. Really appreciate it. Let's talk to Carol now. Carol, what do you think of what our last caller just said?
I think both callers, I thought, made really interesting points. Okay,
what price are you willing to pay? Right?
Yes. What price are you willing to pay? And also, there seems to be a suggestion that a certain kind of practice pervades in, say, European histories, or even particularly in France. So back to Mr. Liu's point about, say, Charlie Hebdo's, existence, how they have always been drawing and publishing such caricatures. I mean, if we look back at the history of Charlie Hebdo, it has not been without flavor. It has actually been rather tumultuous and turbulent. In its previous incarnations as Harikiri or Harikiri Hebdo, it has actually gotten into trouble several times. So, for example, in 1970, it was actually banned for spoofing the coverage of a disaster in a nightclub that killed more than 140 people. And in 2006, then Prime Minister Jacques Chirac actually condemned the Weekly for being overly and unnecessarily provocative. So I think even within European countries, there is still a fair bit of debate and differences in opinions with regards to the limits of free speech and what constitutes a responsible press.
I'll let our Deputy Chief Editor of 938 Live, Jaime Ho, weigh in on this as well.
Yeah, if I could go back to what Mr. Lu and our two callers had said about what the price it is that we're willing to pay. I think that is putting it a bit too simplistically. I think when you link that so clearly to the terrorist attacks and the price to pay, what you're doing is basically driving your editorial decisions by fear, which is what I think a lot of people don't want to do. Okay. I would rather see it by driving our editorial decisions based upon respect and responsibility rather than the obverse, which is driving it by fear. I think it is quite unhelpful. I don't think we should so clearly say that if you do this, terrorist attacks will happen, or use that as an excuse. I think let's just look at it quite clearly as what constitutes media responsibility, as we had started with. And I think
one of the principles, of course, that Carol mentioned was rationality. What else did you say ought to be the guiding principles, Carol?
Being objective, being two-sided in your representation of unemotional and non-partisan.
People might say in media organizations, we have been making such decisions for a long time and none of it resulted in a terrorist attack. But this particular one did. So while we're testing the waters, we can't always predict the sort of impact that it might have on an audience. Should we be forgiving of mistakes if the organization then comes back to say, you know what, we're sorry we did that?
Carol?
Sorry. Well, yes.
I mean, in the case of Charlie Hebdo, I don't think there was much of that going on. They did not apologize for it. But should we expect that sometimes mistakes will happen, and if the organizations apologize, so be it?
I mean, certainly. We have seen that in so many cases of various media publications, right, where apologies were made. And at the end of the day, it is a learning process. Like I mentioned earlier, not just for the audience on, how to enhance their thresholds and how to take things with a pinch of salt, but certainly for media organizations as well. How do you know whether or not you can push the boundaries, broaden the limits and parameters of discourse and discussion if you do not attempt to try new things or push new things? But that said, I think a fair bit of that should be tempered, with sense and sensibility, which I think many media producers, being professionals themselves, are probably, very mindful of.
Some might say that, well, the media organization could have practiced rationality, a sense of balance in its reporting or in the drawing of its cartoons, but terrorist groups will use any excuse, will pick up on anything as an excuse to conduct an attack. So in such cases, really, would it be the media organization's fault?
Well, I think that's an interesting point, right? So you're right to say that if at the end of the day, any groups can find a bone of contention, depending on their agenda. So I think what this debate concerning Charlie Hebdo is useful is that it actually makes us think about not just issues with regards to media responsibility, media freedom, but also underlying cultural and social problems that societies at large are facing. So, for example, all the news reports and opinion pieces that are being written by public thought leaders and opinion writers, they also bring to fore underlying problems that hopefully would be flagged to policymakers, community groups to, solve really pertinent challenges that societies are facing. So, for instance, people are beginning to read and hopefully have more productive conversations about underpinning causes such as the disenchantment of individuals who are radicalized in the process of searching for identity, and how a lot of times such violent acts, whether by lone wolves or terrorist organizations, hint of very often criminal and unstable pasts.
We've got time for one more caller. Tony, good morning.
Hi, good morning.
Go ahead, sir. Very quickly, please.
Yes, I'd like to state that our founding father made a very wise decision to say that race and religion cannot be taken anyhow, and this is what happened in France. And we should always says that they should never ever put prophets into the fire after that and then depict Prophet Muhammad. You have to look at the sensibility of religion and the feelings of the believer. That's all I need to say.
Thank you very much for that, Tony. Now, Jaime, I'd like you to close this off for us. Let's talk about our context in Singapore. Some might say that the media here is a little too careful. Yes, indeed. I mean, as Tony pointed out, it is wise to say that we cannot take such issues lightly. They need to be sensitively dealt with. But are we at risk of being a little too careful, not pushing the boundaries enough to be able to talk about issues of race and religion, for instance, with rationality?
Especially where there are points of contention.
I think we do, and I think we are, and I've said earlier, I think we are moving, and I think we are evolving as a society and as a media. But I think this goes back also to a point that Carol made, and I would characterize it as what the role of the media is, and I would see it in two ways. Are you a leader within society, or are you a mirror of society? And I think it has to be a bit of both in terms of time, both in terms of what the issues you're talking about. And sometimes even within a particular issue, you can do both. And I think the challenge for all of us within the editorial newsrooms is to find this balance. And I think as it stands now, I'd like to think at least within 938 Live, we have found the perfect balance.
to be able to sometimes set the agenda, yes, or to sometimes be a mirror of society.
Exactly, indeed.
Thanks for staying with us, all of you who called in as well. Many thanks for your phone calls. We were joined today by Research Fellow at the Institute of Policy Studies, Dr. Carol Soon, and 938 Live's Deputy Chief Editor, Jaime Ho. Thanks for staying with us on Talkback.